Tuesday morning brought her a feeling of relief. She enjoyed the freedom of knowing that her husband appreciated her photographs and his fantasies associated with her. Lost in thought, she thought about the upcoming shoot and how carefully Jerry planned everything in chronological order. Although it wasn't necessary, her job brought her a lot of money, and participating in photo shoots brought her joy, no matter the month. She thought about the green bikini Jerry had described for the shoot. Knowing his love for her figure, she assumed that the bikini would be minimalistic. She imagined how it would barely cover her body and hoped that Robert, as usual, would be present at the shoot to observe the process and perhaps join in the game. When she arrived at the studio, Amy was ready to go. Jerry was setting up the lighting while Robert looked a little irritated by the calls coming into the studio next door. Despite the jokes and light atmosphere, the shooting was intense. Amy tried on a micro bikini and appeared in front of the camera in various poses on a motorcycle, showing off her figure. When she entered the studio, an atmosphere of anticipation and creativity awaited her. Amy greeted her with a small smile as she sat at the makeup counter. Sophia barely had time to take off her outerwear when she heard Jerry setting up the lights and cameras, and Robert, lost in his thoughts, irritably talking on the phone. The atmosphere in the studio was always tense on days when we had to work with new material, especially with body painting and explicit images, which gave each shoot a special flavor. Jerry came up with something very special for today's photo shoot, Amy said with a playful sparkle in her eye as she prepared her brushes and paints. Today's pictures will not just be provocative. We're going to do something unforgettable. Sophia felt a slight chill along her spine, knowing that today she was in for something more than an ordinary photo shoot. She couldn't help but think that Robert, who was present at the shoot, would, as usual, find a way to add a special twist to the day. Amy, carefully selecting paints and tools, continued quietly. I've never done full-body painting before, but today I'm ready to try. I need to concentrate to make sure everything turns out perfect. And you should also be prepared for the fact that today's session could become one of the most memorable. While Jerry supervised the process of setting up the equipment, Sophia tried to remain calm, feeling the excitement building inside her. She knew that every detail, every pose, and every element of her image had to make the maximum impression. As Amy began painting her body, Sophia closed her eyes, allowing the touch of her brushes to glide smoothly over her skin, creating patterns that transformed her with each stroke. It wasn't just a painting, it was art living on her body, and the feeling of her skin becoming a canvas enhanced her sense of self-worth. When the process was completed, Amy took a step back to evaluate the result. Sophia's body was covered with amazing patterns that simultaneously emphasized her figure and hid it, playing on the verge of frankness and mystery. Every line, every curve of the design was created to attract the eye and leave room for the imagination. Jerry, watching the process with genuine interest, came closer and nodded approvingly. Everything looks perfect now, he said, adjusting the lighting to suit Sophia's new look. We're ready to start. Sophia stood in front of the camera, feeling the gaze of everyone present in the studio. Energy, tension, and excitement were literally in the air, as if everyone was expecting something unusual. The camera clicked and the first shot was taken. Jerry, as always, carefully watched Sophia's every move, adjusting her posture and giving brief instructions. Suddenly, the roar of a powerful engine was heard outside the studio. Sophia turned around. Her heart sank for a moment. It could only be Sean Edwards, a famous athlete and owner of one of the most expensive motorcycles, who, according to rumors, was supposed to participate in the filming. His appearance added an additional element of intrigue to an already eventful day. A few minutes later, Sean's massive figure filled the studio doorway. He looked like a real giant in his thick jeans and white t-shirt that showed off his muscular physique. "Is this a photo studio?" he asked in his deep voice, looking around. His gaze lingered on Sophia and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Robert, who had previously been in the shadows and watched what was happening, suddenly perked up. He moved closer to Sean, exchanging short greetings with him like old acquaintances. Sophia noticed how Robert gave her a mysterious look, and at that moment she realized that today would bring more surprises than she expected. "Are you ready for more?" Robert whispered in her ear. His breath was barely perceptible but exciting. Sophia felt a wave of excitement that covered her head. There were still many surprises ahead, and perhaps some of them could radically change her idea of what it means to be in front of the camera. Sean, examining the studio, slowly walked past Sophia, and she felt his gaze on her, as if he was already imagining her in the frames that were about to begin to be created. This was not a normal workday. Everything turned out as if fate itself was going to intervene and make adjustments to their plans. As Sean walked past, Sophia caught Robert's gaze, who seemed to be trying to tell her something without words. It was obvious that there was more than just acquaintance between these men, and Sophia felt that this would soon become an important part for her. There was a tense atmosphere in the air, and she was preparing for the fact that the day could go according to a completely unpredictable scenario. Amy, as always, kept the atmosphere fun. She waved with a smile as Sean walked closer. "Hey, you have a green motorcycle, right? We have been waiting for you for so long," she said. Sean grinned, his gaze constantly sliding over Sophia's body, where every line of bodily painting emphasized her curves. "Yes, it's me," he confirmed with a slight grin. There was something more than mere anticipation in the air. Sophia noticed how Jerry, although immersed in working with the lighting, repeatedly glanced in her direction and in Robert's direction, as if anticipating something. Robert wasted no time in moving closer, wrapping his arm around Sophia's waist and whispering, "Today is going to be a special day, and you know it, don't you?" His voice was low and soft, sending goosebumps down her spine. She felt his presence, his power over the situation. "Are you ready to show everything you can?" Sophia nodded, her heart beating faster than usual. She knew that every moment here was carefully thought out, and today she had to become more than just a model, she had to become art. Meanwhile, Amy, with her usual ease, began presenting Sean and Robert with various options for how they could use Sophia's body painting and motorcycle in the shots. "The light falls in such a way that it looks almost unreal," she said, pointing at Sophia. Jerry nodded approvingly, still checking the lights and cameras. "The combination of the metal of the bike and the texture of her skin is just right." Sophia stepped forward and took her place in front of the motorcycle. She felt how, under the gaze of Sean, Robert, and the entire team, her body became part of a work of art. Her movements were fluid, and she took Jerry's directions with grace and precision. The camera captured her every step, every movement, as if every moment was planned in advance. "Lean over to the bike," Jerry ordered, his voice firm but enveloping at the same time. Sophia obeyed, her body arched gracefully, and at that moment she felt like everyone in the studio was looking only at her. But then something unexpected happened. Sean stepped closer, his massive figure seeming even more impressive next to her. "Have you ever ridden a motorcycle like this?" he asked quietly, leaning closer to her ear. There was something exciting in his voice, something that made her feel a rush of adrenaline. Sophia smiled slightly, not looking away from the camera. "No, but I think it can be fixed," she replied, feeling the tension growing inside her. "Then you should try," Sean continued, his eyes sparkling with a mysterious light. He looked at Robert, who nodded as if giving silent consent. Jerry, realizing that something unusual was happening, froze for a moment. But then his professionalism took over, and he continued to give instructions. "Sophia, ride the motorcycle," he said. Her body instantly responded to the command, and she smoothly moved and sat on the motorcycle. The coldness of the metal contrasted with the warmth of her painted skin, and this added special tension to the frames. Sophia looked straight into the camera, her eyes full of mystery and expectation. Robert stood aside, watching what was happening with a calm expression, but there was more than just professional interest in his eyes. Sean, standing next to the motorcycle, grabbed her hip with his strong hands, helping her into the correct position. The motorcycle began to move slowly under the weight of her body, and at that moment Sophia felt the vibrations of the equipment being transmitted to her body, awakening something inexplicable inside. It was a moment that had to be captured on camera, a moment when art and reality merged to create something greater. Jerry's camera clicked over and over again, capturing every moment, every emotion, every look. The studio was filled with the sounds of work, flashes of light, rustling clothes, muffled voices. All this created an integral part of the atmosphere in which Sophia felt like the queen of the stage. But at some point, everything changed. Robert came closer, his gaze riveted on her eyes. "Do you really think that's the limit of what you can show?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet but powerful confidence. Sophia realized that another challenge lay ahead of her, perhaps the most important one in her career. But she was ready. Sophia, feeling Robert's intense gaze, realized that events were developing according to a new scenario, which she had yet to understand. She had long been accustomed to her job modeling perfect images in front of the camera, but today everything seemed different. The vibrations of the motorcycle, Sean's touch, and Robert's mysterious hints created the feeling that reality and fantasy were merging into one. Robert took a step forward, his figure momentarily blocking the light from the spotlights. He stood right in front of Sophia, his gaze as deep and meaningful as ever. There was a confidence in his eyes that left no room for doubt. "Today you will become something more than just a model," he said quietly, so that only she could hear it. These words made her heart beat faster. She knew there was more behind them than just playing with a camera. She could feel that Robert was preparing her for something more, for some new stage in her career, or perhaps even in life. In his presence, she felt not only professional responsibility, but also an inner awakening of something more personal, intimate. Sean, meanwhile, continued to hold her thigh. His hand was strong and reliable, as if promising protection and support. He looked at her with the same mysterious twinkle in his eyes that seemed to speak of his intentions. He was not a mere observer. His role in this process was greater than she could have imagined, and the further the day progressed, the more she realized it. "You know that a motorcycle is not just a symbol of freedom and strength," Robert continued, his voice low as the roar of an engine. "It is also a symbol of control, of management, where every step you take, every choice you make matters." He slowly leaned closer to her, his words enveloping her like an invisible net. "Today, you will not simply obey our instructions. You will take on the role of leader." These words shocked her. Sophia is used to being the subject of the camera, following strict instructions and creating the perfect image. But now Robert was talking about something else. This was more than just a photo shoot. It was a challenge. She had to not just follow, but manage the process, become the one who directs and creates, and not just poses. Sophia understood that Robert was offering her more than just participation in the session. He offered her a test of her inner strength. "Are you sure you're ready?" His eyes shone with restrained expectation, but hidden in the depths was a hint that he knew her answer in advance. "I'm ready," she said, feeling the hidden energy awaken within her. She accepted his challenge, ready to show a new side of herself. This was not just a challenge, it was the discovery of her own strength, her own will. Robert nodded and stepped away, giving her space to act. At that moment, she felt the attention of everyone in the studio focused on her. Sean still held her hip. His touch was palpable, but now it did not dictate her movements, it was support, not control. Jerry, behind the camera, froze, waiting for her first step. Sophia sat on the motorcycle more confidently, her body moving smoothly and gracefully. She felt the vibrations of the technology synchronize with the rhythm of her heart. Her every movement, every look and gesture was now her own. She no longer followed directions, but managed the process herself. She looked around everyone in the studio, her eyes lingering on Robert, who, standing in the shadows, watched her with a barely noticeable smile. Then she slowly turned her gaze to Sean. His presence was strong and overwhelming, but now she no longer felt weak in front of him. She felt like she was in control of the situation. "It's time to start," she said quietly, her voice full of confidence and strength. Jerry gave a short command, and the spotlights became brighter. The camera came to life again, clicking over and over again, but now Sophia was not just the subject of filming, she became its owner. She moved her hips slowly, feeling the metallic power of the motorcycle beneath her. Her hands slid over the steering wheel as if it were her own control tool. She no longer needed directions. Her body knew how to move. There was a confidence in her every gesture that permeated everyone in the studio. She controlled not only her movements, but also the attention of those who watched her. Robert watched her transformation silently. His gaze remained riveted on her. He studied her every reaction, every movement. Sophia felt his attention. It gave her even more confidence. It was like an energetic connection that only existed between them. He challenged her, she accepted it, and grew into something more. The motorcycle under her began to move, and Sophia, following the internal rhythm, began to squat, giving free rein to the vibrations and creating an image that was like a living symbol of strength and power. The camera clicked, capturing every moment. She felt like her body was becoming not just a subject of photography, but the main character of this story. Sean, being nearby, could not help but admire her transformation. He moved closer, his hands touching her body again, but this time it was not guidance, but an acknowledgement of her strength. He supported her as an equal partner in this unusual game. "You surprise me," he said quietly, his voice laced with respect. "I didn't expect you to be like this." Sophia looked at him, her eyes shining with challenge and determination. "I'm just getting started," she said, her voice firm but seductive at the same time. Robert, standing aside, understood that this moment was a turning point in her career. She was no longer just a model who did his bidding. She has become a creator, someone who controls the process and creates her own story. On this day, Sophia took a step beyond the usual and entered a new reality, where she was the mistress of her desires and ambitions. The studio froze, watching her movements. This day will be remembered by everyone who was there as the moment when Sophia took control and discovered a new world for herself. Sophia was always devoted to her husband. Their relationship was based on trust and stability. But at that moment, while in the studio, her thoughts began to slip away from the usual framework. The studio no longer felt like a normal place to work, but became a space where she felt different, more confident, strong, and free. The vibrations of the motorcycle, Sean's touch, Robert's intense gaze, all this evoked new, previously unknown feelings in her. She felt like a woman who had power over the situation, but at the same time she began to succumb to temptation. Robert was always in her life as a mentor, helping her realize her potential on set. But today their relationship seemed more personal. She felt that his attention had crossed the line of professionalism. When he approached her again after the next shot, she caught his scent, his breath. Robert stopped next to her, his hand lingering for a moment on her waist. His touch was almost innocent, but there was something more to it. It was a test, testing her boundaries. "You were incredible today," he said quietly, his voice low and soulful. Sophia sighed, trying not to show how much his words and touch affected her. But she knew there was more between them than just a working relationship. In this look, full of desire and respect, she saw not only a professional, but also a man who desired her. Sean, who stood nearby, also did not remain just an observer. His presence seemed more tangible. He looked at her with a certain amount of attraction. The camera flashes continued to capture her images, but she felt like these men were viewing her not just as a model, but as a woman. She couldn't deny that this attention, this energy coming from the two men made her heart beat faster. After the shooting, Sophia was left alone in the dressing room. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and realized how much she had changed over the past few hours. She no longer felt like the woman who had come here that morning, focused on her work and maintaining the image of an ideal wife. At that moment, she felt different. The desire, the sparks of emotion that Robert and Sean had awakened in her were impossible to ignore. The phone rang. It was her husband. She thought for a moment before answering. They exchanged pleasant phrases, and although everything was the same in his voice, Sophia felt something shift inside her. She could not tell him about what was happening in her soul, about the temptations that arose in her. She understood that she had begun to move away from him, although it was not yet obvious to him. When Sophia returned to the studio to say goodbye, Robert and Sean were already waiting for her. Their gazes met, and Sophia felt their presence take possession of her again. Robert came closer to her. His voice was almost a whisper. "Why don't we continue this evening? We have an offer you can hardly refuse." These words made a strong impression on her. She knew what Robert meant. He was offering her something more than just an evening with colleagues. This was the moment when she could step beyond the usual, discover something new, dangerous, perhaps even destructive. Deep down, she understood that this step could change her life and her relationship with her husband forever. She was faced with a choice. Her heart was pounding, as if the world around her had suddenly become smaller, and she herself found herself in the center of some powerful whirlwind. Sean moved closer, his hand touching her waist again, and this time the touch was more confident. "Come with us," he said, and there was no doubt in his voice. Sophia looked at Robert and then at Sean. Both men were waiting for her decision, and she knew that this choice was solely hers. She felt a desire growing inside her, a desire to become someone else, if only for one night. She realized that this was not just a game, and that by agreeing to this step, she would change her life forever. "Yes," she finally said, her voice shaking with mixed emotions. She could no longer contain what she felt and took a step into the unknown, leaving behind everything that was familiar and safe to her. This was the moment when she decided to change her destiny, giving in to a temptation that she could not refuse. They left the studio together, and a night full of secrets and promises was still ahead. After Sophia accepted Robert and Sean's proposal, her mind was filled with misgivings and conflicting emotions. She knew that what she had just agreed to would not only take her beyond the boundaries of her usual world, but could also break boundaries that she had never dared to cross before. Feelings were raging inside her: fear, anticipation, and slight anxiety, but it was too late to retreat. Robert suggested continuing the evening at one of the elite restaurants in the city center. "This is not just dinner," he said as they left the studio. "This will be our evening. Your evening, Sophia." He spoke these words with such confidence that she almost believed that she had chosen this path herself. Sean, who walked next to her, silently supported her with his hand around the waist, as if showing that she was no longer alone, but surrounded by men who completely controlled her future. At the restaurant, they were greeted with all the respect and luxury, as if it was a scene from a movie. The decoration of the hall, dim lighting, soft music, everything created an atmosphere of intimacy and anticipation. Robert chose a secluded table for them in the corner, away from prying eyes. "Today you are our star," he said when they sat down at the table. There was something more than a simple invitation in his voice. It was a promise that the night would be something unforgettable. "I've never done anything like this," Sophia admitted, her voice a little shaky, but she tried to remain confident. She was surrounded by men, each of whom evoked different but equally strong feelings in her. Robert was her symbol of intelligence, charisma, and authority, and Sean was the embodiment of strength, confidence, and physical attractiveness. "We know," Robert replied softly, handing her a glass of wine. "That's why it's so interesting. You need to go beyond what you knew before. You feel it, don't you?" Sophia nodded silently. She really felt it. But every sip of wine, every glance she caught from Sean or Robert only intensified her internal conflict. She knew that what was happening now would sooner or later lead her to a choice that would change her life. During dinner, they talked about various topics about work, life, the arts. Robert was a master at keeping a conversation going. He moved smoothly from one discussion to another, drawing Sophia into the discussions, forcing her to open up. She felt wanted, needed. Her thoughts and ideas were important to both of them. At one point, Sean, sitting across from him, leaned closer and quietly asked, "Have you ever felt as alive as you do now?" His voice was deep and had a hidden power that vibrated in her heart. She understood that these two men knew something about her that she herself was not yet aware of. Their presence revealed a new side of her. "No," she answered honestly, "it's like nothing else." "And this is just the beginning," Robert added with a slight smile. When dinner came to an end, Sophia suddenly realized that all evening they had been discussing anything but her personal life, her husband or family. It was as if everything that connected her to the past had disappeared against the backdrop of the new reality they were creating for her. After dinner, they suggested going to the hotel where Robert rented a room. "Don't think about what's right and what's wrong," he said as they rode up the elevator. "You are here with us because it is your choice. You can stop at any time if you want." Sophia knew that at this point the choice was hers, but she also knew that she could no longer stop. There was a fire burning inside her that made it impossible for her to go back. She's gone too far. When they entered the room, the atmosphere immediately changed. The lights were dim, the air smelled of expensive perfume, and music played quietly in the background. Sean, who had previously been more silent and mysterious, walked up to Sophia and put his hand on her shoulder. "You can trust us," he said, his voice soft but decisive. Sophia looked at him, then at Robert. In their eyes, there was no pressure or coercion, only expectation and readiness to support her choice. "You know this will change everything," Robert whispered, moving closer. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet but confident. They came closer to her, and at that moment Sophia realized that she had crossed the line beyond which there was no return. She could no longer resist the inner desires that she had suppressed for a long time. This moment was inevitable. She made the decision herself. That night, Sophia cheated on her husband, succumbing to the temptation that grew inside her throughout the evening. She knew that now her life would never be the same. Morning overtook Sophia suddenly, like a cold wind on a warm summer day. She woke up in an unfamiliar bed, feeling soft sheets on her skin, but it didn't bring her comfort. Instead, the events of the previous night began to resurface in my head. Robert and Sean left early, leaving her alone in the hotel, as if giving her time to think. However, now the thoughts of what had happened became a heavy burden that weighed down her mind. Sophia lay motionless, her heart beating heavily in her chest, as if anticipating the consequences of what she had done. Her head was filled with fragments of memories, words, touches, the moment when she consciously made a choice from which there was no return. All of them were intertwined with disturbing thoughts about how she could now explain her absence to her husband. Her phone, lying on the bedside table, was a reminder of the reality she had to return to. Sophia reached out, slowly picking up the phone, and saw several missed calls and messages. These were the messages from her husband. "Where are you? You're not answering. I'm worried. Why aren't you at home? We agreed on the time." The last message came late at night. Her husband was clearly worried. He couldn't understand her absence, and she knew she had to give an explanation. She just stared at the screen for a few more seconds, feeling her heart beat faster with guilt and anxiety. How could she explain everything to him? How to justify herself? She sat on the edge of the bed, slowly putting on her clothes. Each item reminded her of last night, of how easily she had allowed herself to be carried away by her emotions and actions. She couldn't believe it had gone this far. This was not just a mistake, it was a conscious decision made in a moment of passion and temptation. Her thoughts rushed from one idea to another. "I can say that I was at work, I was late filming. But he already called, and he knows that something is wrong. Can I continue to lie? Can I just tell the truth?" These thoughts tormented her, and Sophia felt anxiety growing inside her. She looked at herself in the hotel room mirror. Her reflection looked tired, but not just from physical fatigue. There was sadness in her eyes, as if she had lost a part of herself. She realized that, despite all the excuses, she had already cheated not only on her husband, but also on herself. She betrayed her own values and concepts of love and devotion. "What will I tell him?" she whispered under her breath, her voice hoarse with emotion. She knew that when she got home she would have to say something, but the words didn't add up to a reasonable explanation. Sophia understood perfectly well that even if she did not tell her husband the truth, her behavior would change. He will sense this and may start asking more questions. The relationship they had built over the years was now in danger of being destroyed. She imagined how she would return home and see his face, the face of a man who truly loved her, who trusted her. Sophia thought about how he would look at her, how he would ask questions about where she was, and why she didn't answer his calls. This moment seemed inevitable, like an approaching storm. While she was packing her things, her phone vibrated again. This was a new message from my husband. "Please let me know you're okay. I'm worried." Sophia sighed heavily, feeling the lump in her throat growing larger. She needed to say something, but the words felt wrong. She couldn't just write, "Everything is fine," because nothing was good. She couldn't lie and say she was just late at work. That didn't explain her being away all night. Finally, gathering her thoughts, she sent a short message. "Sorry, it took longer than expected. Everything is fine. I'll be home in a couple of hours." This message was not a complete explanation, but it gave her time to prepare. Time to decide how she will talk to him and whether it is even possible to tell the truth. She went downstairs, got into a taxi, and, while the car drove through the deserted streets, tried to figure out what to say to her husband when she opened the door of their house. Deep down, Sophia knew that the truth was too difficult to tell right away. Sophia's husband, Alexei, sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone, which had gone unanswered for several hours. Each minute of his wait felt like an eternity, and with each passing hour his anxiety increased. Sophia had never stayed out of the house all night before, especially without warning. Usually she always reported if she was delayed on set, even for several hours. But this night something was different. She didn't answer calls, didn't write messages, and he couldn't find a place for himself. At first, Alexei tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe they were filming for a long time, and she just forgot to charge her phone. This happens, after all, he thought, trying to convince himself of this. But this version did not last long. Sophia was always attentive to such things, always warned if something changed in her schedule. Alexei knew her habits and, moreover, knew her as a person who values stability and responsibility. When night fell and there were still no messages from her, his worry turned to worry. He started going over all possible scenarios in his head. Maybe something happened to her. Maybe she got into an accident and now her phone is off and I don't know where she is. He even thought about calling the hospitals, but something stopped him. Some part of his subconscious told him that this was not just a coincidence or an accident. By morning, Alexei was already on the verge of despair. The worst thoughts began to appear in his head. What if she cheated on me? What if she didn't come home because she was with someone else? These were thoughts that he did not want to admit, but they were breaking into his consciousness more and more persistently. He felt that something had changed between them in recent weeks. Maybe there was something in her behavior or her gaze that he had tried to ignore, but which had now become obvious. He walked around the apartment, not finding a place for himself. He wanted to believe that it was all just a mistake, that she would soon return, explain everything, and they would laugh at his stupid suspicions. But the part of his mind, the one that was more honest, told him that might not be the case. She never stayed that late, and she certainly didn't turn off her phone. Alexei imagined the worst scenario. He saw Sophia spending the night with another man, perhaps someone she met at work. He couldn't get rid of this image. His heart was filled with pain and jealousy. If she really cheated on him, then what should he do? How can he live with this? How can he return to normal life, knowing that she betrayed his trust? What if this isn't just a one-time mistake? Maybe it's been going on for a long time and I just didn't notice. These thoughts overwhelmed him. He felt powerless, not knowing how to deal with it. He had always considered their relationship to be strong, based on trust, but now that trust was under threat. With each passing hour, Alexei became more and more inclined to believe that Sophia could really cheat on him. The feeling was like a slowly growing poison that seeped into his mind, poisoning his every thought. He began to think about what would happen if his suspicions were confirmed. If she really cheated, what then? He could imagine two options. Either try to understand the situation, talk to her, and understand what led to this, or break up. But both options seemed unbearable to him. How could he continue to live with a man who betrayed him? But also, how could he just throw away everything they had built together? He understood that he needed to wait for her return and listen to her. But how can he calmly talk to her if pain and anger boil inside him? Alexei did not know how to cope with this situation, but one thing was clear: their life would never be the same. When his phone finally vibrated with her message, Alexei felt relief, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, distant feeling. "Sorry, it took longer than expected. It's okay. I'll be home in a couple of hours." These words gave him no answers. They only increased his suspicions. She didn't say where she was or why she didn't answer. The message seemed empty, as if it was written to reassure him rather than explain it. Now he waited for her return, but no longer with anxiety, but with a cold determination to find out the truth. When Sophia returned home, the tension enveloped her like a thick cloud, becoming almost unbearable. Her hands shook as she inserted the key into the keyhole. She knew that she would have to explain herself, but she had absolutely no idea how to do it. All her thoughts were confused in fear of what was about to happen. She felt completely exposed and vulnerable, as if she was walking on thin ice that was about to crack under her feet. The door closed quietly behind her, and she looked around. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, as if time had stopped, waiting for her next step. She didn't see Alexei right away, but she knew that he was somewhere here, waiting for her. "Sophia?" His voice came from the living room, muffled and tense. She stepped forward, feeling her heart beat faster with every word he said. Alexei sat on the sofa, his face was firm, but his eyes were burning with anxiety and, even worse, disappointment. "Where have you been?" His voice was quiet, but every syllable sounded like a sentence. Sophia felt something clench inside her. She knew she couldn't just say she was late at work. This would be a lie, too transparent and unconvincing. He already knew that something more had happened. She was silent for several seconds, trying to gather strength for the conversation that was about to destroy their relationship. Alexei got up from the sofa and came closer to her. His face was tense, and his eyes were full of anger and pain. "Do you realize that I haven't slept all night? I called you and wrote to you. What happened to you? Why didn't you come home?" His questions became more insistent, his emotions grew, his voice became angry. "Why didn't you answer?" Sophia felt it becoming increasingly difficult for her to breathe. She tried to think of words, but they seemed to be stuck in her throat. She understood that there was no way out. She had to tell him the truth. "I—" She began, her voice trembling. She saw how Alexei was waiting for her words, not taking his eyes off her. "I wasn't at work." He clenched his fists but remained motionless, waiting for him to continue. She knew that everything depended on this moment, and yet she could not stop the words that began to break out. "I was with Robert and Sean," she said quietly, but her words sounded like a loud blow in the silence of the room. Alexei frowned, his face twisted in surprise. He stepped closer, his breathing becoming heavier. "What do you mean?" he asked, and barely restrained anger appeared in his voice. "Were you with them? What does it mean?" Sophia lowered her head, feeling tears begin to well up in her eyes. She couldn't look him in the face, but she knew she couldn't shy away any longer. "I cheated on you," she breathed, and at that moment the room seemed to fill with her confession. Alexei froze. His face turned pale, and he stood motionless, as if he could not believe what he was hearing. "What are you doing?" His voice was barely audible, as if he couldn't believe his ears. But his eyes spoke more than his words. They were full of pain, resentment, and betrayal. "I cheated on you," she repeated, louder now, feeling tears rolling down her cheeks. "And not with one, but with two." These words seemed to cut him like a knife. He took a step back, as if he had been struck by something invisible. His hands clenched into fists, and a mixture of shock and rage appeared on his face. "With two?" he asked, his voice breaking into a scream. "You? How could you? How could you do this to me?" Sophia stood in front of him, feeling her inner world collapsing like a house of cards. She understood that no words could explain or justify her action. At that moment, she realized the gravity of what she had done. "It was a mistake," she whispered, but Alexei was no longer listening. He was overcome with pain and anger. He couldn't believe that the woman he loved and relied on had betrayed him so cruelly. "Error?" His voice was full of sarcasm. You call this a mistake? You spend the night with two men and think it can be chalked up to a mistake? He turned around and walked around the room, clearly not knowing what to do. His heart was broken, and he didn't know how to deal with these emotions. Sophia saw him struggling with himself, trying to figure out what to do next. Why? He finally said, stopping and turning to her. There was bitterness in his voice. Why did you do this? I thought we were fine. I thought you were happy. Sophia knew that this was a question to which she could not give a simple answer. Yes, she loved him, but something in her made her commit this terrible act. Something she couldn't quite explain. I don't know, she answered honestly. I'm just lost. It happened so quickly, I didn't think it would. But that doesn't mean I don't love you. Please believe me. Alexei looked at her with pain in his eyes. His face became hard, as if he had closed himself off from her. Do you love me? He said quietly. How can you say you love me after what you did? He turned away again and then slowly walked out of the room, leaving Sophia standing alone, burdened with her guilt and fear that they would never be able to return to their old lives. Alexei left the room. His steps sounded muffled and heavy in the silence of the house. Sophia remained standing in place, feeling her heart grow heavier at his departure. She understood that right now he needed space to process everything that had happened, but that did not ease her feelings of guilt and fear of what might happen next. Alexei walked into the kitchen, unable to sit still. Thoughts were noisy in my head, one heavier than the other. He stood at the window, looking into emptiness. His hands clenched into fists, and he felt anger mixed with pain growing inside him. He always thought that he knew Sophia, that she was a faithful life partner for him. How could she do this? And not with one person, but with two. This thought especially tormented him, as if she had not only betrayed him, but also done it in the most destructive way. What now? He asked himself. He knew that their lives would never be the same again. He couldn't just forget her confession, couldn't close his eyes to what had happened. But on the other hand, he still loved her. This thought made him suffer even more love for the person who betrayed him so cruelly. Alexei sighed. His breathing was ragged, as if he was being choked by emotion. He couldn't just walk away from this conversation. I couldn't leave everything as it was. He knew that he would have to face this pain head-on, no matter how difficult it was. He slowly walked back into the living room. Sophia was still standing there, as if she didn't know what to do. When she saw him, her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to go up to him and explain herself, but she understood that now this could only worsen the situation. She saw that he was at his limit. Do you know what you did? Alexei asked, his voice low and hoarse with emotion. He looked at her with pain in his eyes. Do you realize that you destroyed everything we had? Sophia just nodded, unable to say a word. There was nothing she could say that would ease his pain. She knew that her action had no justification. I always thought that you and I were one, that we can trust each other with everything. I don't understand how you could do this. I never thought we'd get to this point. His words cut her heart into pieces, but she knew she deserved it. Alexei slowly sat down on the sofa, covering his face with his hands. He needed time to collect his thoughts. Sophia came closer, sitting down opposite him on the chair, but did not dare to get closer. I don't know what to do, he said finally, lowering his hands and looking her straight in the eyes. I want to leave, but I'm not sure I can. I still love you, but how can you continue to live after this? How can you trust after such betrayal? Sophia sobbed quietly, her tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve this. I just want you to know that I realize what I did. I myself cannot explain how this happened, but it does not change the way I feel about you. I was wrong, but you are still the most important to me. Alexei looked at her in bewilderment. His mind was clouded. How can he trust her again? How can they restore what has been destroyed? These questions are spinning in his head, but he understands that neither she nor he knows the answer to them right now. You cheated on me with not just someone, but with two people at once, he continued, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. I was trying to understand why. But how? How could you let this happen? Sophia covered her face with her hands, sobbing. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain her actions. There was emptiness inside her. I'm not the same person you knew anymore, she whispered quietly when she could collect her thoughts. I was confused, lost in my desires and weaknesses, but I'm not asking you to stay with me if you can't bear it. Alexei got up from the sofa and started walking around the room again. He needed movement to cope with his emotions. He stopped opposite her, pain and disappointment visible in his eyes. What do we do next? He asked. This was not a rhetorical question. He really needed to know what would happen next. He couldn't stay in this limbo any longer. Sophia understood that they would have a long and difficult conversation. Maybe their relationship is over, she thought, or perhaps they will try to find some way to heal. But she knew one thing: no matter what they decided, it would be a difficult and painful journey for both of them. Alexei stopped again in the middle of the room, his heart beating heavily, as if a fire was burning inside him. His gaze darted around the walls, as if looking for support, but there was no peace in his soul. It seemed to him that the walls of the house that he and Sophia had built were slowly crumbling around him. He knew that he was now on the verge of making a decision that would change their lives forever. I can't, he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. I can't just forget this, Sophia. I can't live with what happened. You ruined everything. Sophia realized at that moment that her worst fears were beginning to come true. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she took a step towards him, trying to stop him, but he raised his hand, asking her not to come closer. Please don't go. Give me a chance to make things right, she pleaded, her voice filled with desperation. She was ready to do anything to get him back, just so they could be together again. But deep down she knew it was too late. Alexei looked at her, his eyes burning with rage, pain, and disappointment. He had never seen her so broken, but that didn't make his suffering any easier. On the contrary, it was even more painful for him to see the woman he loved in such a state, knowing that he could no longer be with her. How can I stay? He asked, his voice breaking into a scream. How can I look at you every day, knowing that you betrayed me? Every time I look at you, I will see them. These men, I won't be able to stand it. Sophia froze, her heart sank in pain. She understood that Alexei had already made his decision. She saw it in his eyes. He was no longer the person who was ready to forgive. Something in him was broken forever. You say you love me, but how can you love and betray at the same time? He continued, not holding back his emotions. How could you decide to do this? I always thought that we were each other's only ones, that we are a team, but you threw it all away like garbage. He turned away from her as he walked past, and Sophia felt panic growing in her chest. She understood that now she was losing him forever. Alexei, please don't leave. There was a plea in her voice that was heartbreaking. She ran up to him and grabbed his hand, but he gently pulled away, as if her touch was unbearable to him. I can't, he repeated. Now his voice was quieter, but this made the words seem even more final. He looked at her as if he was saying goodbye, and this look was full of pain. I was trying to figure out how I could live with this, how we could get back to what we had. But the truth is that I can't. Every word you say, every look you look will remind me of what you did. It will destroy me every day. I can't live this lie. Sophia desperately tried to say something, but a lump squeezed her throat. She felt like she was in a nightmare with no way out. Everything she was afraid of losing was now crumbling right before her eyes. You are my husband, I love you. She finally cried out, her voice choking with tears. You are all I have. I made a mistake, I know it, but please don't go. We can fix everything. Alexei closed his eyes for a second, as if gathering strength so as not to break under her pleas. But when he opened them again, Sophia saw determination in his eyes that destroyed the last hope. Love is trust, and you destroyed it. I can't trust you anymore, and without this we have no future. You chose this path, Sophia. You chose him when you decided to spend the night with them. He turned and walked towards the exit, His steps were firm, despite the internal torment. Sophia, realizing that she was now losing him forever, rushed after him. "Don't go," she screamed. Her voice was full of despair, but Alexei did not turn around. He opened the door, and the cold morning air rushed into the house. Sophia stood in the doorway, her tears flowing in streams down her cheeks, but Alexei had already made his choice. "Goodbye, Sophia," he said without looking back and walked out the door, leaving her alone. After Alexei left, Sophia's life changed dramatically. Everything that once seemed stable and reliable has now crumbled, leaving her alone to face the consequences of her actions. She felt like her world, which she and her husband had built, had collapsed in an instant, and in the emptiness of this destroyed world, she tried to find support. At first, Sophia hoped that Alexei would return, that perhaps over time he would be able to forgive her. But the days passed, and her phone remained silent. She wrote to him, tried to explain herself, to apologize, but he did not answer. This silence seemed unbearable to her, and each new day was more painful than the previous one. In an attempt to escape the pain, Sophia threw herself into work. She began to devote more time to photo shoots, photographs, and projects that previously inspired her. But now these projects did not bring her joy. They were just a way to distract herself, to drown out the inner pain that haunted her every day. Even the most successful filming, which previously filled her with pride, now seemed empty and meaningless. The career success she had built for so long also began to crumble. People around her began to notice her internal tension, her lack of composure, and loss of concentration. She could no longer work with the passion and inspiration that had previously made her special. Companies and clients with whom she collaborated began to refuse contracts, and friends, having learned about the scandal with her husband, gradually moved away. Sophia became more and more withdrawn into herself. Her self-confidence disappeared. She began to doubt her own abilities and whether her career was worth the devastation that had taken place in her life. She realized that she had betrayed not only Alexei, but also herself. One evening, as she sat in the empty apartment that used to be their shared home, Sophia suddenly realized that she could no longer run away from her feelings. She could no longer hide behind work or empty excuses. She had to accept reality. Alexei would not return. Their life would never be the same. She sat on the floor in the dark, surrounded by silence that pressed on her like an invisible weight. "What have I done?" she thought, reflecting on the fact that she had destroyed not only her relationship, but everything that had ever been important to her. Her world became empty, devoid of the joys and meanings that previously filled her life. In desperation, Sophia began visiting a psychologist, hoping to understand her feelings and find meaning in what happened. In these sessions, she tried to understand why she cheated, why she ruined her life, and how she could build something new. She learned about her fears, weaknesses, and inner emptiness, which led her to betrayal. These revelations were painful but necessary. Several years passed, and Sophia's life gradually began to change. She moved to another city, where she started everything from scratch. Her modeling career was no longer central to her life. Now she spent more time working on herself, helping other people experiencing crises in their personal lives and relationships. Her road to recovery was long and difficult, but she learned to forgive herself for the mistakes of her past. Time has not healed all the wounds, but it has helped her realize that every person can make mistakes, and what matters is not what was done, but how you change after that. But sometimes, especially on cold evenings, when she was alone with herself, memories of Alexei returned. She knew that she had lost him forever, and she had to live with it. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.